Disclaimer: the views and opinions expressed in the video are those of the individual and do not necessarily reflect the views of the creators, hosts, or publishers of the video. The video should not be taken as conclusive proof of any phenomenon or event. In the previous episode, we discussed how Mr. A and Mark were able to visually depict the Rs, but were unable to provide an explanation for how it functioned without the presence of an engine, generator, or jet nozzle. Now, let us continue with the story. The cylinder in the middle, they don't know what it is. From 1988 to 1997, which is approximately 8 to 10 years, Mark continuously worked on his own UFO sketch, constantly modifying it. And also, Mark started by going around and asking people. He would attend UFO gatherings and ask many people there. In one of those gatherings, he met a person named Mr. B. I'll mention Mr. B's full name later. And then, someone introduced Mr. B to Mark, saying that back in the 70s, Mr. B used to be in the Air Force and had seen UFOs. He had seen flying saucers made by humans. So, Mark sat down with Mr. B and asked him to describe it. Mr. B told Mark that back in the 70s, when he was still working at the Air Force Base in the maintenance department, there was a busy night. The base was really busy, and the boss told him that a plane had malfunctioned on the runway. So, he hopped on a tow truck and went there, but when he arrived, he couldn't figure out which plane was malfunctioning. There were so many planes on the runway. He asked the boss which plane it was, whether it was an F-16 or an F-15. The boss was probably overwhelmed and in a bad mood. So he just told him to do his job and find out himself. He basically said, just go and find it yourself on the runway. When you see a plane with a malfunction, tow it back. His boss didn't want to be bothered by him anymore. Mr. B said, "Yes, sir," and drove the tow truck onto the runway. He turned the truck and drove along the runway. He mentioned that during that night, the planes were taking off and landing, but he didn't see any planes with engine problems. He couldn't see any damaged planes. So, Mr. B started to suspect that maybe there was a plane with an engine failure inside the airplane hangar next to the runway. He noticed that the hangar door was partially open. At that moment, he thought of going into the hangar and asking if they had a faulty F-16. He wanted to confidently walk into the hangar. But the door was half closed. He saw a flying saucer inside the hangar. Even though it was parked inside the hangar, it was floating there. At that moment, Mr. B was shocked and stunned when he saw the flying saucer. Suddenly, he felt something on his face, specifically on his cheek. Something was pressing against his face. It turned out that there was a machine gun, an M16, aimed at his face. The military officer holding the gun said, "Kid, close your eyes. If you don't listen to me, I'll blow your head off with one shot." So Mr. B closed his eyes. Then, a canvas bag was placed over his head, covering his face. Afterward, 2 military officers dragged him onto a jeep nearby and took him to a certain room within the base. They interrogated Mr. B for over 10 hours. What's your name? Who is your boss? Why are you here in this hangar at this time? What did you see? Whatever you saw is not necessarily true. If you reveal false information, you could be subject to military law. After he left the Air Force, when he met Mark and told him about what had happened that night, Mark never showed the blueprint to Mr. B, but instead suggested they play a game together using pen and paper. How about the two of us? Let's both draw the pattern of the UFO that you saw that day. So, Mr. B said, "Okay, let's do it." And then Mark started drawing. He drew a UFO in the shape of a badminton shuttlecock. And Mr. B also drew a badminton shuttlecock-shaped UFO when they showed it to each other. It was a real moment of laughter and coincidence. Actually, this flying saucer had already been undergoing some tests and activities, at least since the 1970s. This flying saucer had some experimental trials and activities going on. And then later, Mark found someone named Wendell Stevens, who was a well-known collector of UFO photographs. He had a lot of slides, photographs, and film related to UFOs. So Mark found Wendell Stevens and showed him the blueprint, asking, "Do you have any UFOs in your collection that resemble the UFO in this blueprint?" Wendell Stevens, with his exceptional memory, recalled, "I remember having something similar." He remembers everything in his collection, which consists of thousands of photos. He then took out some photos of UFOs from his collection, which were mostly from the 1940s and 1950s, particularly related to Nazi UFOs. They shared a similar appearance to the disc-shaped UFO depicted in the blueprint, much like a badminton shuttlecock. Therefore, we can take the next step and see that this UFO might be from the 1940s during the Nazi era. It is possible that the United States obtained some information about Nazi UFOs and created their own version based on that. So, from at least the 1950s until 1988, they were actually conducting test flights and making improvements along the way. As Mark mentioned earlier, he started sketching this in 1988, and then he met Mr. B, who provided some descriptions. Then he went on to interview many people who had seen UFOs, and afterwards he interviewed Wendell Stevens, who produced some photos from the 1950s and 60s. He compared the UFO in Wendell Stevens' photos with his own blueprints, and began to draw more detailed and beautiful designs. In 1997 and 1998, Mark encountered another prominent figure in the UFO community, named Stephen Greer. However, at that time, Stephen Greer was establishing the Disclosure Project, the goal of which is to publicly disclose the government's alleged knowledge of UFOs, extraterrestrial intelligence, and advanced energy and propulsion systems. At that time, he was fundraising and selling books in the UFO community. Stephen said, "I am planning to organize a press conference where I will gather around 100 or more credible UFO witnesses. This includes individuals with senior backgrounds in politics, the military, and even former astronauts. We will bring together significant UFO eyewitnesses. We will hold a press conference that will be attended by media outlets from around the world. They will interview me, and we will make this press conference a big event. Once it gains attention, our next step will be to submit the proceedings to the United States Congress. I will personally reach out to senators and propose a hearing. Ultimately, Our goal is to demand the U.S. government, including the President, to publicly disclose all UFO records, and I will lead this effort." So Mark decided to believe Stephen Greer. "I trust you, and I even want to participate. Why don't you count me in?" Stephen responded positively, as having another witness and the fact that what Mark was talking about was ARV, which is highly explosive, definitely warranted including him. Stephen then said, "In our upcoming press conference, we aim to provide as much detailed information as possible and make it accessible for skeptics to verify the information." The story will continue in the next episode. Please stay tuned.